Welcome to today's policy forum, Navigating Crisis and Opportunity, UNAMID's Peacekeeping Transition. Today's discussion is on the ongoing transition of the joint UN-African Union mission in Darfur. After more than 12 years of deployment, the mission is now in the process of drawing down, and discussions are underway on how best to reconfigure the UN and AU presence to support the ongoing political change and peace-building requirements in the country. IPI has closely monitored these developments over the past year, and this, in fact, is the fourth meeting that we've held on Darfur since January, culminating in the policy paper that's being launched today. Before turning to the panel for an in-depth examination of the ongoing transition process, I'd like to first thank the government of Germany for their support of this project and invite Ambassador Jürgen Schulz, the Deputy Permanent Representative of Germany, to say a few words. Ambassador, please.
Thank you very much. And first of all, thanks to IPI. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. Great to see all the panelists, and it's great to see the room so full. I think that testifies that the subject you have chosen, we have chosen, is the right one, is a relevant one. And of course, this is a subject we as German government have been working on for quite some time now. As you know, we are an elected member of Security Council in 2019, 2020. And one of our first priorities was to think about the question, how can we do transition processes, how can we manage them well, particularly from peacekeeping to peace building or something else. And this is something that we have been working on for quite a while. And on the issue of UNAMID, together with our British friends, we are co-pen holders on this issue, and a lot of work and a lot of thought has already gone into this. And that's why we are particularly delighted to be here with you, to pick your brains, to discuss with you, to hear from our experts on where we stand and how we go about it. Obviously, we have seen many important developments and decisions over the past month. I mean, we have seen, as some Sudanese representatives have said many times, a new Sudan in some ways. So we also have a very new political situation when it comes to the question, what do we do with the peacekeeping mission? UNAMID, obviously, of the United Nations and the African Union. And we had a lot of discussions on this. We then had a decision by the Security Council at the end of October in a resolution to prolong, to extend the mandate of that mission, and to basically say we need a little bit more time. We need a little bit more time to reflect before we take a final decision of what we do about this. And we want to do this, obviously, in close consultation with Sudan in the first place. This is the most obvious one. But also to draw on the brains of many experts and those who have experiences in transitions and in peacekeeping. So this is where we basically are. The idea is that we have a report to the Security Council by the end of January. Then we have another 2 months or so before the Council will be seized with that matter again. And then the Council will decide how to go about it. And there are, of course, a lot of important issues. I'm sure you are very aware of them. I'm sure you will discuss them in detail today. One is what should be the structure of this mission, what should be the mandate of that mission, what should be the geographic extension of the mission. All these issues are under discussion, of course, and there are no easy answers or fixes. So we are extremely happy that we have the opportunity to discuss this in detail today under the leadership of IPI and with the participation of great experts who have been working on this for quite some time. I wish you good insights, a good discussion, and thank you again for being here with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Let me now introduce our panelists. Starting at my far right, my colleague from IPI, Daniel Forti, who's the author of the policy report. Next, immediately next to me, Charlotte Larbuisson from the Darfur Integrated Operational Team in the UN Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and Peace Operations. Then Natalie Palmer from the Permanent Mission of the United Kingdom to the UN. And finally, Gunnar Berkemer from the Permanent Mission of Germany, the two of them representing the two pen holders on this file. Our speakers will have around 10 minutes. Before we open up to general questions and comments, I'm going to give the right of first response to Husni Mustafa from the Permanent Mission of Sudan, and then we'll see how much time we have. We'll take as many questions as we can. So without further ado, Daniel, let me turn things over to you.
Distinguished guests, colleagues, thank you very much for joining us. I'm honored to launch our publication on the peacekeeping transition in Darfur, a subject that IPI has followed closely throughout 2019. In the interest of time, I'll divide my presentation into 3 parts. I'll start by highlighting the report's key messages, and then I'll briefly overview each of its main sections. I'll conclude by delving a bit deeper into the report's final section, which outlines some priorities that we think should inform the upcoming stages of the transition. First, as some would say, here's the bottom line up front. The peacekeeping transition in Darfur is among the most complex the UN has ever had to undertake. This complexity is rooted in many factors, some inside of the UN's control, remit. Perhaps the most important factor is that the transition was initiated despite the absence of a comprehensive political settlement, which was rightfully identified by the African Union and the UN as a central pillar of any sustainable exit strategy. In light of recent political developments throughout Sudan, the peacekeeping transition has thoroughly tested many of the UN's emerging principles regarding mission transitions. For example, transitions are inherently political undertakings and are premised on how the UN reconfigure its engagements with a host society. Successful transitions depend, in part, on how well the UN can achieve system-wide integration on the ground and strengthen coherence with a range of national counterparts and international actors, and that transitions need to be flexible and adaptable, especially in dynamic political environments where the host country reassumes ownership over a range of security, governance, and development priorities. Up until April 2019, the mission and the UN country team were making headway on the transition, even as there was little progress on resolving the core political questions of peace in Darfur. Significant changes across Sudan now present a unique opportunity for the Sudanese people to pursue a comprehensive peace agreement. While the UN and the AU can provide meaningful support to these efforts, they should not lose sight of the political, security, and operational issues that will continue to impact UNAMID's transition. Achieving progress in these areas, and by extension protecting the viability of the peacekeeping transition in Darfur, requires the organizations to focus on coherence, adaptability, and sustainability moving forward. So with those key messages in mind, I'll outline the report's 5 main sections. The first discusses a number of reasons why the transition is among the most complex the UN has ever had to undertake. These largely revolve around the mission's unique configuration, including its hybrid UN-AU structure and the fact that it is not integrated with Sudan's UN country team, as well as the challenges inherent to peacekeeping in Darfur. The second section provides an overview of the mission's drawdown and transition concepts, which were articulated in 2 successive UN Security Council resolutions between 2017 and 2018. The report argues that the political and operational pressures have limited UNAMID's effectiveness and relevance, and thus were what prompted thinking around the mission's exit. The transition concepts themselves, which comprise a rapid, multi-phase security drawdown, a reconfigured footprint, and accelerated peacebuilding and integration efforts, were in part designed to navigate these pressures while preparing the UN to sustain its long-term engagements in the region. The third section examines how UNAMID and the UN country team implemented this transition's whole-of-system approach. It specifically looks at transition planning processes and does an in-depth examination of the state liaison functions, which are joint mission country team frameworks where embedded mission staff undertake joint programming with UN country team counterparts, and these are funded by UNAMID's assessed budget. This section also discusses challenges in protecting civilians and sustaining human rights engagement amidst a rapid security drawdown, as well as efforts to mobilize political engagement amongst a deadlocked peace process. The fourth section of the report highlights the ways in which Sudan's political revolution impacted the peacekeeping transition. After briefly summarizing the events that took place between April and August of this year, the report looks at UNAMID's mandate renewals from this past June and the factors that led the AU Peace and Security Council and the UN Security Council to temporarily pause the drawdown. It also portrays how security dynamics in Darfur changed after the downfall of the Bashir administration, as well as how this political upheaval gave new life to Darfur's peace talks, which are currently taking place right now in Juba. The final section of the report identifies 5 priorities that should inform the next stages of the peacekeeping transition. While I'll only provide a brief snapshot of each of these, the report goes into thorough detail about the various policy options contained there within and the trade-offs for each. We encourage strengthening political engagement on the transition between the UN Security Council and the AU Peace and Security Council. The two councils' engagement on this file is imperative for the success of both the peacekeeping transition and of Sudan's governance transition. To sustain this engagement, the councils need internal unity and aligned political strategies. Second, we discussed translating the October 2019 joint political strategy between the AU and UN on Sudan into an effective follow-on presence. The AU and the UN need to ensure the primacy of any follow-on presence's political mandates, which should then be reinforced by all other aspects of its work. In designing a new presence, they will need to consider whether to maintain a Security Council mandated mission, whether to expand its geographic focus beyond Darfur, and how to divide up the work between the UN and the AU, some of the issues that Ambassador Schulz mentioned in his opening remarks. Third, we encourage the organizations to reinforce the transition concept. The mission and the UN country team should undertake stronger joint planning efforts and strengthen national ownership over the transition process. They should also scale up peacebuilding work, identifying opportunities for new actors to complement the already ongoing peacebuilding initiatives, and then begin to focus on questions of their long-term sustainability. Fourth, we encourage integrating human rights and protection into all areas of its work. The UN and AU should be careful of undertaking these issues and ensure that they are reflected in political engagements at the national and subnational level. We also encourage inclusive and multidimensional protection of civilian efforts, continuing to prioritize efforts that are already strengthening justice and the rule of law institutions in Darfur, exploring new approaches to early warning mechanisms which have been impacted by the transition, and accelerating planning for the mission's security drawdown. Finally, we focus the report on sustaining international attention and financial support during the transition process. To address the significant peacebuilding and development requirements in Darfur over the coming years, the UN and the AU should consider how they can make funding for the transition more predictable and streamlined. They will also need to navigate how best to do this while considering the separate but equally urgent efforts of supporting Sudan's macroeconomic recovery. The international community also needs to sustain political engagement on the mission's transition and in Darfur more generally. To close, the peacekeeping transition in Darfur is the first of many complex mission transitions the international community will need to navigate over the coming years. UNAMID's exit strategy, drawdown, and reconfiguration offer lessons for other transitions in challenging environments that are characterized by fleeting political settlements and persistent conflict drivers. We hope that this report helps reflect UNAMID's transition experience and lessons, and that they can be used to help improve future mission transitions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Daniel. Charlotte, let me now turn to you.
Thank you. I want to thank IPI and the Permanent Mission of Germany for holding this event and for the invitation. We have read with great interest the IPI report, and I would like to congratulate Daniel and the IPI team for very well researched and solid analysis that will be very useful to us as we envisage the next steps of the Darfur transition and in the context of future transitions as well. So I will talk today a little bit about the Secretariat's perspective on the transition, including some of the challenges we have faced, how the transition has evolved over the past year, and considerations for our future engagement. So we started this transition from peacekeeping in Darfur in a very different environment. Another government, another envisaged end state for the UN's presence in Darfur. With the events that took place over the past year in Sudan, the transition from peacekeeping is itself taking place in a transition, Sudan's democratic transition. So our engagement with the host country has evolved as the Sudanese authorities changed their views on UNAMID's departure and on the UN's future engagement in the country. So this has required us to adapt to changing circumstances and to shift the trajectory of the peacekeeping transition. What the situation looks like in Darfur after UNAMID exits possibly looks quite different than what we were envisioning at the onset of the transition. So the transition from peacekeeping in Darfur was initiated out of the assessment that the challenges were no longer of a peacekeeping nature, but some of the conflict drivers remained unaddressed. And our objective, UN and AU, as UNAMID is a hybrid mission, was to leave responsibly to set the base for long-term peace building in Darfur. So conceiving the concept for the transition meant rethinking our engagement in Darfur and how we could continue to support the Darfuris in addressing those remaining challenges after the mission exits. Our objective here was to provide sustainable solutions to critical drivers of conflict to prevent relapse. We had to make sure that as UNAMID's presence was reduced in some areas, we would not only ensure that other mechanisms were in place to address these challenges, but also ensure the ownership of the Sudanese authorities in the process. As Daniel has mentioned, a transition is a political endeavor, and UNAMID's exit had to be accompanied by renewed political engagement with the authorities as we redefined our support in Darfur, and obviously in conjunction with the African Union as our key partner. On the ground, we needed to increase the presence of UN agencies, ensure they would be equipped to deal with current challenges. To that end, we envisaged the mission working closely with the UNCT on joint priorities to reduce the risk of the reemergence of conflict. And as Daniel has mentioned, this is the concept of the state liaison functions that we developed. The objective here was to avoid an approach where the mission just hands over tasks to the country team. And in that context, the state liaison functions have proven to be a very valuable mechanism. They have contributed to enhancing the UN country team's presence and operations in Darfur, making them better positioned to respond to the population's needs in areas vacated by the mission. They have been an integration mechanism for the UN system in support of the government of Sudan that should play a catalytic role in building peace. Now, the implementation of the transition has faced a number of challenges that some of which Daniel outlined. Some of them have to do with the UN's configuration. Indeed, the mission and the UNCT were not integrated. Some of these challenges have to do with the context in Darfur. As was mentioned, that includes the unaddressed conflict drivers, but also critically the lack of a peace agreement. And finally, the economic and political crisis in Sudan over the past year. So the first two were sort of known factors when we started this transition, but the third one has altered the trajectory of our transition in Darfur in major ways. The events of 2019 have impacted the transition in terms of substance and duration, have created a new enabling political environment for the transition. They have forced us to adapt to a new context, testing the flexibility of a transition from peacekeeping. Some of those changes, some of them Daniel highlighted, including the drawdown, which was paused in July 2019. The mandate of UNAMID was also extended until 31st of October 2020 at the request of the Sudanese government. And importantly, the Sudanese government and Sudanese authorities have revived the peace process, and the Security Council requested UNAMID to support it, as well as the implementation of any peace agreement. And while we were only going to close the mission, we're now in the process of devising options for a follow-on presence. So since the transition takes place in a different political environment, we have adjusted our political engagement. Our main objective is to support the priorities of the transitional government, in particular its first priority, as articulated in the framework for the program of the transitional government that was finalized this month, putting an end to war and building fair, comprehensive, and sustainable peace. And to that end, as per the last resolution, Resolution 2495, UNAMID is supporting the peace talks in Juba, playing a facilitation role in support of the South Sudanese mediation. The mission is also supporting the Peace Commission, including with outreach to non-state actors in Darfur, particularly women, youth, IDPs, to ensure that their voices are heard. At the same time, we continue to lay the ground for long-term peace building in Darfur by preparing to expand the state liaison functions to the Greater Jebel Mara in January 2020. Security concerns and the limited presence of the country team in that area continue to present challenges to this expansion process. So a key goal for us will be to strengthen our partnership with the Sudanese authorities and increase their ownership in the state liaison functions to sustain the progress that we have made so far. Last May, we proposed revised benchmarks to serve as long-term indicators of progress. They included three main axes: the political process, institution building, and long-term support to stabilization. In this new political environment, we have been able to make progress on those faster than we expected at the time. However, the conditions on the ground in Darfur have not fundamentally changed, and we need to ensure we continue our efforts there. So looking ahead, the Security Council has requested a joint AU-UN special report, which will include options for a follow-on presence to UNAMID. Designing a suitable mechanism is a key priority to ensure we provide adequate support to the authorities to consolidate peace. We currently have a small multidisciplinary team in Sudan that is consulting with the authorities on their needs and their vision for this presence. So without prejudging the conclusions of this mission, there are a few parameters that were discussed among the government, the UN, and the AU last October. They include national ownership, a mandate that is clear, focused, sequenced, prioritized, and achievable, no military force component, a mandate under Chapter 6 or 8 of the Charter of the United Nations, a deployment timeline that would not exceed the transition period, a light presence, and geographic footprint. Our first priority here is to ensure this presence responds to the needs of the stakeholders in the peace process. We will be ready to support them in the implementation of peace agreements that are reached during the peace process. One key aspect for us is the partnership with the African Union. The format is to be determined, but we want to ensure that we continue to work together. In addition, a whole-of-system approach is also key for us. It's important to ensure adequate coordination and use the different sides of the organization's comparative advantages, and we want to continue doing that. So to conclude, the concomitant transitions in Darfur and in Sudan are an opportunity to ensure that the support we provide is in line with the new phase the country finds itself in. We need to seize it to get the peacekeeping transition right and help the new authorities build peace. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Charlotte. And I think in a way the final part of your presentation in terms of setting out a set of principles and the fact that there is a joint report that will be coming before the council soon sets up our next two speakers quite well. So to get a council perspective, Natalie, let me first turn to you.
Thank you, Jake, and I'd like to share other colleagues' sentiments by thanking IPI and our co-pen holder, Germany, for convening this conversation. In a true co-pen holder spirit, we'll split things up a bit here, and I'll give a bit of a sort of perspective on the sort of history of the drawdown and how we got to this stage that we're at now before handing over to Gunnar to have a bit of a perspective on potentially what next and where we go from here and some key things that are coming down the horizon. I would certainly agree with Daniel in saying that this is the most complex transition that the UN has undertaken to date, and certainly setting the sort of parameters for future complex transitions that the UN will undertake in other peacekeeping settings. So I think, the drawdown started really in earnest in the summer of 2017. And Charlotte alluded to some of the factors that led to the Council taking the decision to beginning to draw down the mission. I think the one of the key things was that it was true that the conflict in Darfur was at one of its lowest levels since the civil war started in 2003. We also were dealing with a very, very difficult host state at that time. The previous government of Sudan, it was no secret they did not like UNIMID. They did not want UNIMID to be deployed within their country, and they took quite extensive efforts to obstruct the implementation of the mission's mandate. But as has already been mentioned, it was a bit of an uneasy process, particularly for the United Kingdom, given that we did not have a sustainable peace agreement in place, and many of the root causes had not been addressed, and there was still conflict, particularly in the Jebel Mara region of Darfur, which continues at low levels today. For the UK, the priority was always to have a gradual, flexible, conditions-based and responsible exit. And I think touching on the council dynamics, we've certainly improved. Council unanimity, can't say that word, council agreement on the way forward. But going back to 2017 and even as early as this year, there was certainly sort of two camps in the council. Those who were very happy to see the mission leave and the mission leave quickly, and those of us like the UK who were more concerned about the continued challenges that were in Darfur, particularly from a protection of civilians perspective, and that we were leaving and potentially creating significant security vacuums as the mission withdrew. But the factors, as I mentioned, that the council was divided on this, and to be frank, there were financial pressures as well that I think dictated the speed. Between 2017 and this summer, the mission reduced by 3/4 in terms of its troop footprint. So within a sort of 2-year space, it went from 16,000 troops to 4,050, which for an area the size of France is quite stark to have gone down that quickly. But we recognised as well, and whilst we as the UK had our concerns, that UNIMID was not necessarily the right tool to continue to address the challenges that remained in Darfur, and that is why we went for the sort of two-pronged approach that was already mentioned, where we saw peace building start to take place in the areas of Darfur which had not seen large-scale conflict. And then a continued focus on peacekeeping in the Jebel Mara region of Darfur, where the government continued to clash with Abdul Wahid and his forces. And then we also tried to implement, or have the mission implement, this whole-of-system approach, and really trying to address the challenges of the UNIMID not being integrated with the UN country team, recognising at that stage that the UN country team were going to take on the vast majority of support that remained once UNIMID left. I think this year has really shifted the ground across the whole of Sudan, and it's also led to the council really re-examining any assumptions that we had about the direction of travel. I think it still remains true that UNIMID in its current configuration is not the most appropriate tool to address the challenges in Darfur, but we had a new opportunity. And when we came to renew the mandate in June, you'll all be familiar that there was not a transitional government in place at that time. So we extended the mission, did a rollover. until October, just to let the dust settle and see what happened in those few months. And thankfully, by the time we came to the mandate renewal in October, there was a transitional government in place, and we were starting to see really, really welcome changes from the new transitional government in Sudan. So Resolution 2495, which the Council adopted in October, extended UNIMID for 12 months at the request of the Sudanese government. And I think if you told some of us working on this that would have happened even 6 months before, it would have been inconceivable that we would have a Sudanese government asking and recognising that they needed the support of UNIMID. So that was very, very welcome. Charlotte mentioned that we asked the mission to focus on the peace process. This is not a new task. UNIMID has been part and parcel of the peace process and the mediation since its deployment. But given the new opportunity there was with the Juba process to make sure that they were there and providing their technical expertise and support to particularly the Darfur armed movements. We also asked the mission to continue with protection of civilians. We hear regularly from our colleagues on the ground from UNIMID that there are still significant protection concerns, particularly for women and children. And as I mentioned, Jebel Mara still continues to see clashes. We've seen displacement in that region that continued throughout this year. And there's also a continued need for humanitarian support, and UNIMID has an important role, particularly in Jebel Mara, in helping to facilitate the delivery of that humanitarian aid. But I think critically in terms of this transition, we paused the drawdown of UNIMID until March, the end of March of 2020. And there was a few reasons for that. We wanted to align with the peace process and help to try and build confidence. It was clear that the armed movements see UNIMID as a facilitator and a mechanism which helps to build their confidence in the peace process. And we also wanted to give time to the government of Sudan. We were adopting this resolution when the Prime Minister had been in office for, I think, about 40 days. And it was clear that the government needed more time to decide what they wanted in Darfur going forward, and to what support that they thought that they needed to accompany them on their broader transition. So we're at a state just now where the troop ceiling of 4,050 and the police ceiling of about 2,500 is maintained. And in March, the Council will reconvene to decide what next with the drawdown of UNIMID, but also what we might do with the options that the Secretariat provide us for a follow-on. And with that, I'll pass over to Gunnar to give some perspectives on what we think might happen in the next few months.
In true co-penholder spirit, Natalie left the easy part for me to speak to. I think I would agree with Daniel's assessment that it's indeed a complex endeavor that we all are engaging in. But there are three reasons why I'm slightly optimistic that there is really a good space to get it somehow right. And this is a triple opportunity. That this is first and foremost buy-in by the government of Sudan. It was mentioned. I think we take it very seriously as co-penholders, it's also in the resolution. But as a principle, there is the opportunity to shift this around and make it a mission that the Sudanese, the government, but also the people of Sudan really want. The second one, Natalie alluded to it. I think there's also different spirit in the Security Council, and I think it was hidden from no one that on this peacekeeping operation, the Council was maybe more divided than on any other peacekeeping mission, probably. And the third element of this triple opportunity is that I think we as the UN, as the AU, have a chance to move the mission closer to the actual needs on the ground and to have a clear look as to what is needed. And Natalie spoke to some of the elements. And I will try to give you a couple of ideas as to what we think is important that we should keep in mind when moving forward, also partially responding to some of the elements Charlotte mentioned. If we look at Sudan, of course, it's totally correct to say there is a new Sudan. But at the same time, from our perspective, there are also the old issues in Darfur that we know about and that have historically been drivers for division in the country. So addressing the needs of the periphery is by no means something that should be left as a also run, but should be part and parcel of the broader peace process moving forward. So this is one of the challenges that we have to confront, and now the question is, how can we address that in a follow-on presence? What are the policy options that we have? And I think the first thing we have to recognize is maybe just looking at precedent will not solve the problem only. So how previous transitions have gone are helpful to understand, and we are thankful for the in-depth analysis that IPI has conducted on previous transition processes, but maybe we really have to think about a different type of peace support operation that would take into account this duality of supporting the political process, continuous support to the political strand in the negotiations that are also currently undergoing, but also to address the remaining peacekeeping and peace building needs. And I say explicitly peacekeeping needs because I think we have been a bit uncomfortable with the notion of saying that peacekeeping in Darfur in 2020, by definition, doesn't have a place anymore. We recognize major changes, but we also think that some of the key protection needs need to be addressed by an impartial actor as long as there is no trust between the population, parts of the population, and the security service providers. So, and this will not change immediately once you have a peace agreement. This has to grow over time, and we are concerned that there's more time needed than UNAMID has on its current mandate. So we have to think beyond this. So we have to think about protection capacities that would need to and are able to address some of the protection challenges, be it around Jebel Mara, be it around some of the IDP camps where the government of Sudan currently doesn't have access. So do we have to look into this? We think we should. In the same line of thought, if there is a peace agreement, do we need an impartial actor to verify, to observe what has been agreed? Potentially, yes. What are the tools? Do we see, in other cases, military observers? Yes, we do. Is that something that would need to be thought about in the context of Sudan? We're definitely interested in looking into how this is needed, if this is needed. Another element in terms of lessons learned from the Sudan Darfur case, and Daniel mentioned it, the integration in the form of the state liaison functions, basically bringing together the country team and the UN mission at a very late stage, but nonetheless. And so we think this notion of working in an integrated manner is quite important for delivering now, but also looking ahead, because indeed the follow-on presence shouldn't be there for 10, 15 years. At the same time, we don't think that necessarily we now have to define at what time it would be good for the follow-on presence to leave. So we shouldn't attach it now to a specific date or period, but really think about end states and not about end dates. I think another element that we are thinking about is this mission will be designed in a moment in time where we don't have full visibility about the peace process, what comes out of the peace process, what are the needs. So there's a high degree of flexibility that has to be built in the mandate. Additional tasks that maybe are already conceived of, but have to come into practice at a later stage once the parties to the conflict, the peace talks, are ready to have them implemented. And I think at the same time, we have to see that we now configure a operation that is realistic, and Charlotte spoke to the need to have realistic and implementable mandates. I think as panelists, we're very interested in delivering this, but at the same time, we have to be ambitious in the tasks that the mission has to carry out, because this is really a moment where we can make headway on some of the key issues Natalie mentioned. One other element that is related to being ambitious and not being ambitious is the question as to, is this a mission that would try to solve each and every problem that Sudan has? Or do we try to tailor it to those areas where UNAMID has already a track record that are needed by the government of Sudan, but where the UN could also deliver? We don't want to set up the mission with a task that is unrealistic. So we have to maneuver between wanting to provide answers to each and every problem, but also being very specific as to what the UN is well placed to do. And of course, there are broader discussions about reform in Sudan, where maybe other actors have a much stronger track record and much stronger tools than the UN has. I think I'll leave it at that for the time being, and looking forward to your questions on and thoughts about how we should move this forward.
Great. Many thanks, Gunnar, and thank you to the panel. I mean, one of the things that I'm struck by listening to all of you is the situation, not just in Darfur, but Sudan generally, is incredibly fluid. And there's a transition process underway where many of the key questions underpinning that transition are yet to be decided. And in many ways, the direction in which that transition, that reconfiguration takes place is in part resting with members of the council, and we've seen in the past that at times there has been a lack of consensus within the council on the way forward. We've heard about the importance of the UN's relationship with the African Union and other regional partners, being as this is a joint mission and a situation in which the regional partners have actually played a quite constructive stabilizing role. But ultimately, this is a transition that very much needs to be determined by the new transitional government in Sudan, which itself is grappling with a moment of profound political change in the country, but also quite significant economic and other challenges. I think there are a number of issues that hopefully we'll come back to when we open things up for the Q&A around the potential role of the AU, around how best to support the political process, what a protection presence could look like, the question of the geographic focus. But before we do that, Hosni, let me give the floor to you for the perspective of the government of Sudan, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jake, and also thank the IPI for hosting this interesting debate on this issue, and a special thank to Mr. Forti for the very comprehensive report. We went through this report over the weekend, and it's really professional and comprehensive. Thank you so much for that. I agree with most of the briefers. The unique nature of UNAMID is really an interesting issue. We need to look at this nature because the establishment of UNAMID in 2007 after the liquidation of MS was in a partnership, a unique partnership between the African Union and United Nations with Sudan. So there was negotiations to establish the missions through the 3 packages at that time, they call it, in 2007. That ended by the 3rd package was the hybrid operation. So that led to UNAMID during the first period was very active in the issues of mediation. That goes to the declaration of the shared commitment on peacekeeping operations and the initiative of the Secretary General, primacy of politics. The Doha Agreement was one of the fruits of a mediation from the special joint mediator of the African Union and UN, Jibril Bassouli at that time. So now, this unique partnership is a success story so far for us in Sudan and in Africa. The cooperation between the African Union and the UN is going on, it's continuing on all, especially between the African Union Peace and Security Council and the UN Security Council in terms of exchange of views, the harmony in the resolutions and decisions in Addis before New York. Then the UN was very keen not to leave anyone behind on the consultation process. The host country, the African Union, the pen holders, and the Security Council members. So the A3 also the African members of the Security Council. What we are now going, and I would like also to thank the co-pen holders, Natalie and Ghana, Germany and UK, for their efforts to not only work on the UNAMID transition, but also on the visioning exercise of the post-UNAMID era in Sudan. That is very interesting. And I recall here the Berlin workshop. That was interesting. Thank you so much for hosting Germany. And this is helping, and this is as part of the new momentum of the new Sudan. Sudan after December Revolution now is no longer that old Sudan. So you mentioned it very, very clear, Charlotte, that the new vision of Sudan is different than the old vision of Sudan. Now, Sudan is looking forward to cooperate with the international community, with all the friends. And few days back, the friends of Sudan, for the first time, they met in Khartoum. And they pledged new methods of support, political support, financial support, economic support. And this support is not only for the transition in Darfur from peacekeeping to peace building, but also for the governance transition in the whole country, in the entire country. Because there is a relation of interdependence between the two transitions, the governance transition and the peacekeeping transition. When you look at it, any relapse in any transition is going to impact the other transition process. So that's why the holistic approach is imperative and is very important to make sure no relapse and to go forward to counter the challenges of peace building on the ground now. You mentioned earlier, Daniel, that this issue of the mandate of UNAMID, like protection of civilians, like humanitarian access or humanitarian delivery, or even the political process, is no longer challenged like before. So now the challenge is the peace-building efforts, the process of mediation in Juba process, and there is a good news. Yesterday, the parties prolonged the Juba declaration for more 2 months in order to allow the parties to negotiate more and to reach agreement on that, and that is good. We also expecting very good development by the beginning of the year in terms of the economic crisis. You know that there is some bottlenecks in this, and now the bilateral relation with America is taking also, stepping a new momentum after the visit of the Prime Minister to DC this month. And we are expecting also breakthroughs in this. Now the level of diplomatic relation between Sudan and the United States has been upgraded to the levels of ambassadors for the first time in 23 years. And this is we see it as a very positive progress towards a full normalization of bilateral relations. That is important for what? For the economic recovery. Economic recovery and transformation is very important for the transition process, because that is going to support peace-building efforts, open the country. There is new also dimensions of human rights respect, justice, democracy, women participation and equality. Those all are in the comprehensive process of governance transition. There is more political participation now, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of political parties, not like in the past. Those were some challenges in the past. Now, those are no longer. So now we think the important and pivotal issue is the national ownership. Natalie, Gunnar, and Charlotte, Forty, all of you stressed the issue of the national ownership. Now Sudan is embarking on specifying and putting the top priorities of transition in order to help the international community to accompany Sudan towards the transitional from peacekeeping to peace building, as well as to a full democratic free elections in the future. So I would like to also highlight the issue of the UNIMID following the process and supporting the process of mediation in Juba. And I would like to jump to also new development in terms of the Sudan mediation in the conflict in South Sudan. Now we are trying to push also the process of the peace process in South Sudan after the 100-day extension of the pre-transitional period. And Sudan was organizing the visit of Dr. Riek Machar to Juba and is meeting with the President Salva Kiir Mayardit, because we believe that peace in South Sudan is a peace in Sudan. And this is also has an interdependence nature. In order to make peace and to build peace in Sudan, we have to assure that there is peace in the region. That likewise in Central African Republic, Sudan is still supporting the efforts of peace agreement and implementation in Central African Republic through the African Union mechanism. Also, as you all know, they signed the Khartoum agreement on peace process in Central African Republic. The regional dimension is very important, and we are also looking forward to see some stability in other parts of the region like Libya, Chad, and we have a very good bilateral relation with Chad. The Prime Minister yesterday was in N'Djamena in these efforts to harness the spirit of stability and peace in not only Horn of Africa, but also in Central Africa region. So all the support that we receive from the international community is welcomed, and we look forward to continue our cooperation with all of you, and thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Osni, for very valuable perspective. We're now going to open up to the audience. We have, let's say, about half an hour before I'll want to come back to the panel. So if you want to take the floor, if you could please introduce yourself. We'll take a number of questions, come back to the panel for responses, and then we'll see where we stand for time. So please, the floor is open. I've here and then here.
My name is Ram Chaluri. I'm from Princeton, New Jersey, with the Peace Coalition. My question is, given what this gentleman just said, that the U.S. somehow supports some peace building in Darfur, given the history, given the turmoil in the U.S. itself, meaning you can't really depend on what anybody says anymore because things change pretty quickly. So what confidence do you have that even USA becoming partner in making this peace, what confidence is there that it will be followed up?
Our colleague from Canada, right here.
Thank you. Catherine Nadeau from the Permanent Mission of Canada, and thank you to IPI for this very interesting panel. One of the things that we've seen in transitions over the years is this mismatch between the expectation of the population on what transition means and what transition can actually deliver. And I'm wondering from the panelists if you can speak about whether there's been some thought given to how to manage that in the context of the transition with UNIMID. Thank you.
And there's one more over here.
Hi, thank you. My name is Snezhana Voksha-Kaufman. I'm from DPO, Security Sector Reform. My question is about the role of the African Union. A lot of you mentioned the importance of the partnership and that this transition and the follow-on presence will sort of be conducted together with the African Union. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit more on what the thinking is right now, on what the role of the AU would be, and maybe also, sort of the dialogue in the council, maybe with the A3, So what is coming forward from that? We know also the AU is undergoing big reforms right now, and whether that will have any impact vis-a-vis the AU or maybe also IGAD. Thank you.
Okay, seeing no other questions, I'll come back to the panel. Daniel, maybe let's start with you.
Sure, I'll give a couple of different thoughts. First, to my colleague's question over here about the U.S. support in Sudan. I think it's quite obvious that the United States, as a bilateral actor, has had a varying relationship with the government of Sudan. But I think if you look at the different ways that the U.S. government works, there has always been a clear constituency that wants to see peace in Sudan. At different periods of the conflict, that has come in different ways. Clearly, as my brother Husni mentioned, the economic challenges and the improvement of the bilateral relationship really matters. And just to say, even with the current political challenges in the U.S., there is still a constituency that wants to see support in Sudan. You've always seen the emergence of the U.S. in the Troika position in terms of political engagement. You've seen the State Department and civil society always having a strong conversation about it. So just to say, I think even through challenging times, there has been engagement on Sudan, and I don't see any reason why that wouldn't continue. On the question from Catherine on communicating with different communities in Darfur about the transition, maybe Charlotte can provide a bit more detail about it, but I think from an outsider's perspective, throughout much of 2019, communicating the transition has been a priority for the mission, and either through the leadership's engagements, through the community platforms that happen, through the SLFs, part of their activities have been to communicate what the transition concept, more or less up until October, has been. I think perhaps from my outsider's perspective, one of the challenges now will be casting what the new transition concept looks like, and how do you rechange or set a different set of expectations, which, again, will be a new lesson for us all studying transitions closely. To my colleague on the UN-AU partnership, I'll quickly highlight my bias, and that's the other major file I've been working on closely this year. And I think the colleagues on the council can speak to some more of the formal political engagements, but just to highlight that, there are clear comparative advantages in terms of operational presence between the UN and the AU, but I think the AU's political engagement, with the Sudanese government and the transitional support they provided from April to August, gives them a clear entry point. I would also say forging closer alignment between AU and IGAD is another real advantage. IGAD has new political leadership that came in over the past month. It's the former Ethiopian foreign minister who, was probably closely involved in this. So I think there is a stronger constellation where the AU can play that bridging role. And just to say, I think other transition experiences have highlighted a range of formal and informal ways where the organizations can cooperate.
Thanks, Daniel. Charlotte?
Thank you. I think on the second question, on the sort of mismatch between expectations and reality for the transition and how we communicate, I think Daniel is absolutely right. Communicating about this has been one of the mission's priority. Since over the past year, they have engaged at different levels and with the communities on the ground. And I think one element that is clear is that, while UNAMID might be leaving, it doesn't mean the UN is leaving. And that is a key message that we have reiterated on the ground. It's not because this mission is leaving that, the UN and the AU are just abandoning Darfur. And we're very well aware that there are remaining challenges. It's just a matter of shifting our engagement and our configuration on the ground to respond to those challenges. So I think that's been sort of at the core of our messaging. In terms of the partnership with the African Union, given that the options in terms of our configuration are currently being designed by our team on the ground, I can't really talk about structure, but the bottom line for us is that the engagement and the partnership is critical. The form we'll have to see what form it takes, but we will continue one way or the other to work very closely with the AU.
Natalie.
Thanks, Jake. I think on the first question, I mean, it's very much a bilateral issue between the US and Sudan, but I would just echo what Daniel says, that even through difficult times, the US have very much been a partner for peace, along with ourselves and Norway. They are part of the Troika and have been for some time, and we as a Troika have been very, very involved in the peace process. In Darfur and also in South Sudan as well. But also as a member of the Council, we have quite clearly stated in Resolution 2495 that come March, end of March, we will mandate a follow-on. And I think that's quite a clear signal that of them being part of that decision, that they are committed to being a partner in peace for Darfur and Sudan more broadly. I think Charlotte and Daniel have covered the question on expectations of civilians. But it's something that we've been mindful for. When we visited Darfur earlier this year, we took the time to engage with IDP communities and hear their concerns and what they would ask us as a council to reflect on. So it's something we're very mindful of. The role of the AU, as Charlotte said, we need to wait and see what role Sudan wants the AU to play, what role the AU themselves want to play. But I think it's undeniable that they have played a very important role in UNAMID and also in the broader transition in Sudan. They were very, very critical throughout the sort of summer months this year, and helping to mediate between the TMC and the FFC. And then on the dialogue with the A3, I think the A3 are very, very important when it comes to African issues in the Council. And, we're losing them shortly, but Côte d'Ivoire have a very unique experience. They've gone through this sort of transition process themselves, but the A3, I think, play a key role in sort of sometimes bridging the gaps between the AU-PSC and the UNSC, and helping us to come to a common decision there, and we saw earlier this year when the council was unable to pronounce itself on the transition, that the A3 were the ones that spoke out and took quite a strong stance there. So I think we can always rely on our colleagues from the A3 to take a very active role and play a critical role in the negotiations that we have on the follow-on as well.
Okay. Good. We'll come back to excuse me. We'll come back to the audience if there are further comments, questions for the panel.
Hi there, I'm Anna with Oxfam, and just curious to know to what extent there have been consultations with civil society in Darfur on the transition itself. I've heard sort of some mention here and there about it, but interested to know a bit more what sort of structure was in place or mechanism to provide for that, as there has also been this echoing of the challenge around protection of civilians being something that civil society in Darfur is concerned about till this day.
Others? In the back.
Hi, Alex on from Columbia University. Just a quick question on impartial actors, and you had mentioned some of the speakers about military observers, so I guess how do you envision that? Can you speak a little bit more to that? Thank you.
Last call. All right, seeing none. We'll come back. Why don't we go in reverse order this time, actually? Gunnar.
Sure. Maybe just starting on the community dialogues. I think Charlotte can speak to it more clearly, but also UNAMID mission mentioned to us that there was a strong push from their side to organize meetings with parts of civil society to take into consideration what their needs were going forward. And certainly we have done this when we were, the both of us in Sudan in September, but also our embassies in Sudan regularly reach out to not only those groups that are represented in Khartoum, but also in Darfur, because we think it's really important that the needs of the population in Darfur are heard and also reflected in our responses to their needs, because we really think that we have to be able to respond to the drivers of conflict and just because we have a transition undergoing doesn't mean that all grievances are gone all of a sudden. So I think this is a very, very important point, and I understand that the mission UNAMID is also very keen on getting these voices out and take them into account. Maybe on the second questions around military observers, that was to flag that some of the needs that might emerge from a peace agreement maybe are not known today, but certainly we are interested in being with a man at being able to respond to needs by the Sudanese actors that think that maybe the AU or the UN should have a role in helping to supervise whatever they agree on. And so there's certainly this possibility, and other circumstances military observers have played a role. If you think about the recent new mission in Colombia, where the government and the FARC have clearly asked the UN to play a role in destroying weapons, but also overseeing verification tasks. So it's not clear that this is needed, but it's certainly something where we would be very keen on making sure that a mandate doesn't exclude this from the get-go, and maybe has an option to do this if this is needed. Maybe there are other actors, but maybe it's also a good way of getting independent third-party verification into a system which is clearly lacking, at the moment, clearly lacking trust.
I wouldn't add much to that, apart from to say that there's actually already a framework for UNAMID to play a role in as a verification monitoring party. If you look at the Doha document for peace in Darfur, which was agreed in by some of the parties in 2013, it's a very, very extensive document that details the role that UNAMID would play in the implementation of a ceasefire. Of course, the peace talks are not being necessarily negotiated on the basis of the DDPD, but that gives us sort of a sense of the role that a neutral third party could play if there is a comprehensive peace agreement in the near future.
Thanks, Anna. Charlotte.
So on the question on consultation with civil society, indeed, as Gunnar has said, this has been a key priority for the mission, and I would say at every level we have engaged with the communities on the ground, with with the IDPs, with women's groups. We've tried to be as inclusive as possible here, and we've done it. The mission has done it. We have done it this year. For example, we had a high-level visit. We have 3 ASGs that went to Darfur to support the transition, and they themselves engaged as well with those communities on the ground. That was one of the key goals of the visit. So the concerns have very well been taken into account. We've tried to understand the needs of the populations, and this understanding, I think, has sort of gone into the thinking that went into the state liaison functions, because again, and that sort of answers the second question on POC. I think we have been clear that challenges remain, and we have heard the concerns of the population. But again, we're just sort of shifting our engagement here, and protection of civilians is very much amongst our priorities. That's why we want to work with the government in terms of capacity building on rule of law, for example. We're expanding our work on human rights. So there are sort of different approaches that we're taking to ensure that protection of civilians doesn't fall through the crack. And we see our role here, and is to support the authorities in establishing the right mechanisms so they can continue the work that we have been doing.
No? All right. I think it's worth remembering, the UNAMID is just about 12 years old, right? 2007. So, if you think about the conditions that existed in Darfur at the time when the mission was deployed essentially to stop a genocide, and the fact that now we're talking about, there's ongoing peace talks in Juba to try and reach a comprehensive political framework for the country. There's, of course, a new government in Khartoum. The change over that 12 years has been remarkable. And if you go back just 12 months, and think about where we were when we began talking about the transition of the mission, it is a fundamentally different environment. And I think it really underscores the continued dynamism in the situation and the need, as Daniel and several of the speakers highlighted, for a continued flexible, adaptive approach to be able to respond to changing conditions on the ground. And Gunnar, I want to come back to close to something that you said that I really liked, which is that this really is the opportunity to shift the mission to best support the government of Sudan and the Sudanese people and provide them what they actually are looking for, what they want, and what they need at this moment in time. Maybe to close, it's worth noting, I said at the outset, today is, of course, to launch the IPI policy paper that came out, and that this was the fourth discussion that we've hosted in this room on Darfur. It will not be the last. I think one of the obligations, in a way, that we feel in providing analysis on a situation that continues to unfold is to continue to monitor it over the coming year, and our intent is to continue to provide analysis. So we look forward to having our speakers and to having all of you back in the near future. So thanks very much.